The following is not meant to serve as medical advice. It is merely the story of my own journey and learning process. All the Unexpected, Season 3, Episode 1, Map Your Birth. Have the distinct pleasure today of welcoming a mama and a doula and everything sort of in between. Our guest for today is Katelyn Commerford, and I am super excited to sit down and chat with her about her work, all of the sort of stories that she's got to tell us, but also talking a bit about how different life is on two very different sides of a big pond. And so we'll do a little bit of both of those things. And so, hi, Katelyn, how are you?
Hi, I'm all right, thanks. I've got a bit of a cold, so if I'm a bit raspy or a bit snuffly, you'll just have to excuse me. But we're coming into winter here, so it's all the bugs are coming out of the woodwork.
Yeah, always the hemisphere differences of temperature and weather. Always
Yes.
Yeah, so we had Memorial Day, which is the marker of summer in the US, and so people are on beaches in full force.
Yes.
You guys are sort of buttoning down the hatches.
Exactly, lighting fires, yeah.
Yeah, although we live in Western Montana, so it's still kind of what most people would say winter temperatures here.
Yeah, that's fair.
That a bit. Well, maybe kind of just tell me a little bit about yourself and your story and how you ended up becoming the doula and Instagram, how we met, the presence that you are today.
Yeah, so I have two beautiful girls, and they're 3.5 and nearly 4 and 18 months old. And when I went to have my first baby, I fell pregnant really easily, and I was kind of rushed, which was great, but I was kind of rushed into making a decision about model of care. And obviously that kind of stuff is going to be quite different in Australia compared to what it is in the States. But I ended up, because of that, going under a private obstetric model that really didn't align with my philosophies and my beliefs about birth. And in the end, I ended up having a post-dates induction that I really didn't want and didn't feel I needed, and which led to a cesarean, which is not uncommon for a first-time mother. And then after that, I kind of fell deep into the world of vaginal birth after cesarean, known as VBAC, and all that research. So that was kind of like what I lived and breathed from the moment my first daughter was born. And it was pretty quick that I discovered that the best way for me to give myself the best chance, I would be better off birthing at home with a private midwife. And so I found one who actually was a family friend, and very quickly built a relationship with her. And then when I was pregnant with my second, I brought her on board and was planning what's known as a HBAC, or a home birth after cesarean. And then that was a beautiful pregnancy, beautiful, because like I was uncomfortable in a lot of ways, but I wasn't stressed, whereas I'd been stressed my whole first pregnancy because I was anxious every appointment that I would go into. And that's just not how it should be. Like you really need to be comfortable with your care provider and feel really warm and fuzzy around them, really. And I had that second time around. It was amazing. And I also brought on a doula because I wanted my eldest at home with us while we birthed, and I wanted there to be some level of support for her, as well as assistance for my husband, kind of encouraging him in how to encourage me. And yeah, then I had a really long labor. I went into labor spontaneously at home, which was just far and away from the experience of my induction, which it took me a long time post that birth to accept that was a traumatic experience. I think because I had quite a positive and uncomplicated cesarean from it, I felt like I couldn't I felt like I couldn't refer to it as traumatic. It felt like, well, I knew the repercussions of the decisions I was making, and so therefore I just have to own this. And that's not how our nervous systems work. They don't play by those rules. And as it was, the cesarean itself, even in my body, wasn't traumatic, but the induction was. That induction had me feeling like I was going to die, and no one was seeing that, and it was quite terrifying, really. So this birth going spontaneously was just incredible. And then, things just started happening. Like, my daughter woke up in the middle of the night. She was crying because she wanted me to comfort her, even though we'd done all this preparation. And then she noticed that my doula was there. So then she wanted Amy to read to her, because that's what we discussed. Like, oh, Amy will be able to read you stories and things when she's here. And so she's like, Amy, read to me. I was like, Amy's rubbing my back right now and I need her. So it was like, then it's that she wanted me to comfort her, and it was like 2 a.m. She'd been asleep for, only a few hours because we'd gotten home really late. She'd gone to bed at 9, which is super late for her. And then I just said to my husband, you need to just take her and sit with her, and she's going to cry, but she needs to go back to sleep. She's not going to get any more relaxed or any more calm. She needs sleep. And that was really tough. And I think there was a lot of guilt over how she was born that I hadn't acknowledged, I hadn't got worked through, that started surfacing in that moment, because then I was feeling guilty that I wasn't available to her then. That started things sort of changed a bit for me, whereas I'd felt like I'd been laboring really well and really productively. It was really hard work, but it felt really good. And then it stopped feeling really good, and it started feeling like something wasn't working anymore. But I kept at that for a few hours, and then eventually we called my midwife to come and check and say, like, tell us what's going on here. We don't feel like we're getting anywhere, but it's like every 3 to 4 minutes still these contractions, and yet they just don't feel like they're doing anything. And she did assess me and say, look, it seems like this baby's really high up, but like I was 7 centimeters dilated. She's like, you don't have a head anywhere near cervix, and you're still dilating, so that's amazing. But your baby's not really engaged in the pelvis properly at all. She's budding on your pelvic bone, which made a lot of sense because I could feel that sensation and a contraction pressure on that front of my pubic symphysis, and which is at the front of your pelvic bone. And so once I had that information, we kind of just kept going for a while. I was like, okay, can I understand and visualize what's happening? And I'm going to try and figure this out. And it did feel at one point, we did a bit of work to try and help her into a better position. And then I could feel a burning in my hips through a contraction that is quite normal. Your pelvis is literally opening at like its joints. And but for me, I associated that with the sensation of the induction that I'd had, where I felt like I was being set on fire and ripped apart. And I immediately just kind of shut down, and I was like, no, it's burning. And they all said to me, it's okay, it's fine. And I was like, no, it's not. It's not fine. But I don't think it literally took me about 12 months after that birth to realize that connection. And that's why that had happened. And honestly, I don't think I was ever going to be able to push her out after that. I think that was the it for me. And she stayed up basically. And I kept laboring for another 12 hours or so after that. And we just weren't getting anywhere. I wasn't any more dilated. My contractions were spacing out. And I said, okay, it's time to go to the hospital. And maybe if we get waters broken, then that will help. Oops, sorry, something's just falling down over there. So my midwife made the arrangements. And we'd been checking on Bab all day, and she had been fine. She was barely knew she was in labor. It was great. So we got to the hospital, and they did break my waters. They did a controlled break because the head was quite high. We didn't want to do it at home for the risk of cord prolapse, and labored for a few more hours, and it was just clear nothing was changing. And I was really running out of steam by that point. I think I was about 27 hours in, and into my second night of no sleep. So I could see the writing on the wall, and I sort of thought, well, I can have an epidural, and that might be enough to just let my body relax, maybe, or I'm going for a cesarean, so I'm going to need some kind of anesthetic anyway, so I might as well get the epidural and see what happens. So I did that. And before too long, doctors were in there a bit worried about her decelerations after the contractions and recovery from them. And we just said, no, it's time now to go for a cesarean. And so we made that decision. And it was interesting for me because I was sort of rolling down the hallway to theatre going, I am feeling so many things at once. And there was a lot of, there was definitely disappointment and there was grief over the birth I really thought I was going to have. But there was also a real sense of peace and accomplishment in that, like, I had really met that labor. Like, I had really given that everything. And the way that my birth team had supported me in that, like, the whole day had just been about, okay, this is the information, this is the situation as I see it. What do you want to do? Here are some options if you need help, like, figuring that out. And then they'd say, okay, yep, no worries. And if at any stage there was any actual danger, it would have been a little bit different. The attitude would have changed a little bit to be like, I really recommend, or I really suggest, because this is otherwise what's going to happen. But that wasn't the case for me. And it was, it kind of just opened my eyes because I thought I really felt like I needed that home birth, beautiful home birth to make my previous birth better. And what I realized, so many things, was that a better birth isn't just about pushing a baby out of your vagina. It's also not there to repair the previous birth. That work has to be done separately. Like, it might be great and it might give you a real sense of accomplishment and it might help, but it's not ever going to be able to undo what already happened. So there was a lot of that. And I just, I knew that the whole time I'd been going through my pregnancy with my incredibly wonderful and supportive care provider, I was in a lot of VBAC groups and watching women just struggling with this journey to VBAC. And I thought, I want to be able to do something. Like, I really, birth work had always interested me. I kind of toyed with being a midwife when I first left school, and thankfully didn't ever go down that route, because I think I would have been a very different midwife to what I would if I did that today. I did start studying midwifery not long after I had Flo, but then I fell pregnant, which is my eldest. I fell pregnant with Stella, my youngest, not long after. And so I was like, we'll just put that on hold. And then instead I thought I might just do a doula course and see how I feel about that. And I loved it. Like, as soon as I got into it, I was like, yeah. And I feel like this is where I need to be, even more so. I think this is better for me than midwifery right now, because they have it really tough, midwives, because they really want to be there for you and they really want to do exactly what you want. Like, they want to, but it's they're really kind of restricted by guidelines and policies of where they work. So in Australia, our privately practicing midwives have the most autonomy, but they also still have a system that regulates them, which there should be. There kind of needs to be this. There needs to, if you're going to have a protected term like registered midwife, there needs to be obviously guidelines around how they work and how they practice. But it also, there is a real attitude here, and I'm sure it's the same in the States because it seems to be worldwide, quite a pervasive idea that home birth is unsafe, and that anybody who is encouraging it or supporting it or working within it is, radical and irresponsible. And that's just not evidence. That's not research. That's not accurate. And here we end up with our poor private midwives being reported to the governing bodies quite frequently when they transfer women into hospital. And the trouble is that that's when it becomes dangerous. When midwives don't feel safe transferring women to hospital, that's when it's a problem. And most of our midwives are pretty, like, they've got thick skin. They're not going to let something like that stop them from giving women an accurate, like, a proper level of care, but it can be pretty full on. So Yeah, and then when you've got VBAC, which in the hospital system, so we do have a very small amount of publicly funded home birth in Australia, but there's only a couple of hospitals that offer it. And the criteria for being in those programs is really, really limited. So it's very restricted. And VBAC would definitely not. You don't get that option. So the system does see like VBAC as like a fringe and radical and risky option, I suppose.
Just, I want to circle back to something you were saying before. You said when you were first sort of pregnant with your youngest and you were in the VBAC support groups and stuff, and you said that you noticed that women were having this really tough time. In what sense? With their own journey, or providers pushing back, or what was the sort of kind of largest issue you saw women generally facing at that point?
The biggest issue was definitely it was definitely providers, and the trouble we have in the public system, which is where most women are, is that they have what's called fragmented care. So they're seeing a different person at every appointment. So sometimes they'll go into some appointments and say, I'm having a VBAC, and they'll be met with a really positive reaction of like, yeah, that's amazing. Well done. Super impressive. And we're fully behind you and no problem. And then the next appointment they'll come into, someone will be like, well, that's really dangerous. And, you might rupture and your baby might die. And so they're on this tumultuous roller coaster the whole pregnancy, where they don't know what they're going in for. Every time they go in for an appointment, then they're second guessing themselves. And I've seen it as a doula in appointments with clients. Sometimes I go to their antenatal appointments if they're receiving a lot of pressure, and just to kind of be there as a buffer. And I usually don't say anything. I just kind of sit there alongside the woman, and you'll find that they feel a lot better because they're not just there on their own. And often the care providers are more cautious about explaining everything and giving actual like fully information, and not saying things that are just complete bullshit, which does happen sometimes. Sorry. And so it is more a care provider thing. And we talk about the bait and switch, even with some care providers where women do choose them, specifically like a private obstetrician, and they yep, I'll support you. I'm happy to do VBACs, no problem. And then at about 35, 36 weeks, you start to see, oh, I think your baby's growing a little bit too big. Or actually, you know what? It feels like we should probably book in a 40-week cesarean date just in case. Or, you know what? Actually, I'm not sure about just X, Y, and Z. There's a myriad of things that, your blood pressure's looking a bit high. Well, probably because they're stressed coming into this appointment. You've just mentioned that they might need to have another cesarean. So that can happen too. And you just see a surprising amount of pushback, given that the research on VBAC is really good overall, and that it's like when people are birthing in a hospital, they already have access to all the emergency medical care they could need in that instance. And yet they still seem so nervous about it and so anxious about it. And the reality with VBAC is that the only risk that changes is your risk of having a uterine rupture where the uterus opens at the incision site. But that happens as commonly, not common, but as commonly as other obstetric emergencies like a cord prolapse or like a placental abruption, or, those things that can happen in any pregnancy. But you don't go into every appointment in pregnancy when you have none of those, no previous cesarean scar, and have an obstetrician tell you that you should book in a 39-week cesarean because you might have a placental abruption. That's not what we see in all pregnancies. It seems to just be a real hang up with VBAC, and it makes it really difficult. So, we know that most women who plan a VBAC have a vaginal birth. It's about a 70-odd success, in inverted commas, rate overall, but only about 12% of women with a prior cesarean scar are having vaginal births. So the culture is to go for a repeat cesarean. without question. So it does make it feel like this thing that's like dangerous and unusual and, radical and whatever else. And the reality is you're just using your body to birth as it was built to do. So yeah, it's a challenge. It is a real challenge.
I would imagine. And I think there's some cultural similarities in that sense. I think you see similar stats, if not probably worse stats on the side of the ocean in general. And there's quite a bit of interesting history with regards to when it was recommended, when it became sort of de-recommended, right? And then a sort of muddled history there. So I thought it was interesting that you were talking sort of briefly about these other functions, so that, your eldest daughter had this image that the doula was going to read her a story, right? And so I think maybe for some of the listeners that aren't necessarily super familiar with what is the role of a doula? So as you see it, what is this role? What does a doula do for, I guess, not only, sort of the person who's giving birth, right, but the family as a whole in the unit. So maybe just kind of talk on that for a little bit.
Yeah. It's a common misconception, that the doula is kind of like going to come in and no one else will have a job. That's often a concern actually from partners, is like, oh, well, if you hire a doula, like, what will I do? So I see a doula's role as being there to support not just the woman, but also the family. And it really, the tricky thing is it's very dependent on the family and the individual needs of that woman and that family. But mostly it's providing physical, emotional, informational, and like advocacy-based support, really. So in home births, it looks quite different to hospital births for obvious reasons. Like there's not so much of the advocacy role that's needed, or even the informational role. People are generally well researched themselves when they're going into home birth. And if not, they're quite comfortable asking their care provider, and the care providers are quite good at giving a balance of information. Whereas in hospital, it's a lot harder. Women sometimes don't feel comfortable asking questions of their care provider, or when they do, they get an answer that they go, well, that doesn't sound right. Can you show me the research? And the doctor goes, don't, it's there. Don't worry about it. And you go, okay, well, that sounds legit. But yeah, so often, I mean, it's antenatally, it's about helping them develop a birth plan, or I like to work with the birth mapping format, which is something that doula and educator here, Catherine Bell, she wrote a book about called The Birth Map. And it talks basically all about, rather than having a plan, which feels structured and feels hard to move from, you have a map and you have pathways, and you know that at different points there's going to be different decisions to make. And it's about sort of considering what decisions you will make as different things potentially happen. What is your decision about when you hit 40 weeks, 41 weeks, 42 weeks? It probably changes and it's different for every woman. And what is your decision if this happens in labor or this happens in labor? So we go through a lot of that, a lot of possible outcomes, and a lot of how are we going to, like, what that will look like and what's important in those different moments. So it's, very informational, a lot of just sort of in-person support in that time too, like attending appointments sometimes, and that kind of thing, and just getting to know everybody, so that when I turn up in labor, it's not like a perfect stranger. Like there is a bit of relationship, and feel quite comfortable and safe in my presence. And then during labor, it's really, there's so much. There's a lot to do with like pain management, which is a big thing, and working with pain. And so I'll often help with like acupressure or massage, or using rebozo to do different sort of body work things to help things if things are feeling a bit stuck, or there's a bit of discomfort that's quite specific that might indicate a poorly positioned baby or something. And then helping sort of be, an advocate at the time, because often in a hospital birth, if you're not meeting certain markers, which are very sort of have a very, very slim narrow view of what birth should look like, there'll be a suggestion to do an exam or to, break the waters or to put something on the baby's head or whatever it is, and just having a presence there to give the woman the comfort that somebody's got their back, and also helping them, remind them to ask questions. And if they're not feeling like that's a thing that they want to do, that they can say no, always. It's your body and it's your baby. But a lot of it is about like the partners. And so some partners are just MIA. Sometimes I'm just like the whole person, and that's all. That's totally fine. That's usually the case in like families that that's going to be the case in advance. It's not. I don't find that happens so much as like a surprise, like, oh, I really thought you were going to be here doing a lot of stuff. But with the partners that really want to be involved, so much of it is sometimes just making suggestions like, oh, why don't you try this pressure point or whatever? Or do you think you could grab her water bottle and just make sure she's drinking, or whatever it might be, so that they feel like they feel much more comfortable and encouraged in getting into that role of support person, and they kind of have a clearer idea of what they're doing. And it can often help them just sort of like feel like, oh yeah, okay, all of this is normal. Because, women make a lot of noise in labor as well. And sometimes they get worried. They're like, what is this? Is everything okay? It's like, yeah, this is birth, basically. This is all fine. And they go, all right, great. Cool. No worries then. We'll keep at it. And then, with home births as well, often it's the little kids, it's the siblings and stuff. So sometimes you're in the kitchen making them a snack and dad's looking after mum. And, she's just birthing away like a goddess, and you're there just keeping the other kids occupied and also making them feel safe too. Because again, a birth photographer friend of mine said she was at a birth once with the eldest sibling was 8 years old, I think. And she said you could see her whenever the mum was like really roaring, she would sort of look at everyone's faces around the room. And when she could see that no one was worried, she would just basically then she would calm and she would sort of settle. And she was quite happy once she knew that everyone else was happy. So it was it's a pretty wide role. And then in postnatal, it's different again, because it really depends again on what that woman is going through, what the baby is like, what the family is like, what their support situation is like. So I mean, sometimes I'm there like making meals, and sometimes I'm helping them do their like government benefits form and things like, it really varies.
Yeah. And so, I think it's an interesting thing, because I've seen some tips sometimes for someone choosing doula, right? So is it one of those cases where, okay, you meet the first person and you go with it? Or if you were to give a mom advice, what should you look for if you're actually going to choose this person? What does that look like? Do you interview people? Do you ask questions? How should someone sort of going about selecting the right person?
Yeah, definitely interview people. And I always say to women who are interviewing me, if they're not already talking to other doulas, they should be. Because one of the best ways to know that it's the right person for you is to talk to a few and go, okay, well, actually, I had a really good connection with this person and not with those ones. Or I felt pretty good about all of them and I'd be quite happy with all of them. So I'm going to make my decision on a different factor, like their package cost, like how close they live to me, like how much experience they have, or what their story was, or whatever it might be. So I always recommend interviewing, and a lot of it is going to be about just a general sort of connection. Like a doula should really feel kind of like an old friend, like someone you were very comfortable around and who makes you feel safe, not someone who makes you feel like a little bit nervous or a little bit anxious, or if you don't feel totally comfortable asking them a question that you're worried might be stupid, for example, they're not going to be the right doula for you, because that's the opposite of what you want. You want to be able to be fully vulnerable around them, because that's kind of how you need to get in order to birth. And also just about their birth philosophies as well. It's a little bit different here than in the States. We don't have as much of a certified sort of thing. Like we're less concerned about certifications and things here. And a doula technically is it's an unregistered, unregulated profession. So anybody could tomorrow just decide to call themselves a doula and start working in that world with zero experience and zero training. So it might matter to you to ask them about what training they've gone through and, what their experience is like. But I would suggest that it's going to be different for every person, but that would always matter less to me than what they were like as a person and how I felt they were with me and how I felt they would be with my family. But for others, it depends on where you're birthing as well, because sometimes you're like, no, I really need someone who's very experienced at being in that particular hospital and that birth unit and knows what doctors are going to be a little bit challenging and which midwives that we should try and get into the birth room and whatever else. So it will depend on the birth and will depend on the woman and the family, but it definitely interview. Most doulas expect to be interviewed. I always offer an obligation-free meet and greet. I'll usually try and have a bit of a conversation with the woman first, because sometimes, I'll be driving 45 minutes to go and chat to somebody only for them to just be completely unaligned with me, which happens not super regularly, but it does occasionally. So usually having conversation on the phone or something with them first, just to be like, yep, okay, we're pretty on the same page. Let me come and chat to you and meet your family and see how we feel. Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of different
Great
factors.
advice. I think a lot of people, I appreciated what you said about vulnerability, right? Because you are going to be at your literal most vulnerable ever, right? So if you can't feel comfortable, then this is not the scenario. That's a great piece of it. I wanted to circle quickly just back because I had never heard of this and I thought it was a fascinating idea of birth mapping as opposed to birth planning, right? And so I think that's a great thing. And if someone just is completely novice with doing it this way, what would be the best way to kind of start doing it? I know you briefly mentioned a book, so can we kind of mention that again?
Yes.
Some advice as to how you would even kind of start making a birth map if you were going to do that, and maybe when you would start thinking about that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So there is a book. The book is called The Birth Map. And it's by Catherine Bell. And Catherine's actually doing her PhD based around the book and doing it as a qualitative study. Yes, a qualitative study around women's experiences of using the map compared to a traditional birth plan, and how they felt that helped them or didn't help them. So that's going to be really interesting to see as well, because I have a feeling she's going to revolutionize the world a little bit in this, because it's much better received by care providers because it doesn't come across as this hard set of rules that you want to follow for birth. And it's also just, it prepares you better for the process of birth and labor, because, people always say, birth is unpredictable, so you shouldn't make a birth plan. And I think that's the exact reason you should make a birth plan. But it's not about saying, this is what will happen, X, Y, and Z. Like, here is what's going to happen. But it's actually about, this is the decision that I've made. And it's not about it being wishes or preferences or, something that is really easy for someone to override. It's like, this is my decision. If I am at the point of maternal exhaustion, I will choose an epidural. That's the decision I have made. If I have an epidural, I want this to happen. Like, I want my support team to, use aromatherapy and acupressure and peanut ball to support my physiology and my hormones at that point. If my baby is breech at 38 weeks, I have decided to be transferred to this hospital that does vaginal breech births. If my baby is breech presentation in labor, I will be having a vaginal breech birth. or not, or no, that scares the pants off me. So I will be having a cesarean. And, it's about just kind of, it's really hard to go through every single eventuality, obviously. But, and some things will kind of, you'll sort of brush through like, oh, yeah, yeah, that's fine. I'll just have, if that happens, cesarean, if that happens, cesarean, sure, no worries. And then it might be that if those things come up, that's where having gone through the map, you can kind of go, oh yeah, I remember hearing about this. This is not a new thing. This is not so scary because I've thought about it before. So a lot of it is about the routine stuff that happens in the care. So if particularly for labor, like vaginal exams and like augmenting labor, like pain relief options, all of those things. And it's I love the way she talks about it being decisions, because I think that it's so easy for people to say, my preference is, and for care providers to say, okay, well, that's great, but that's not what's happening. When you say, I have made this decision, that's quite different. And it gives you a lot of power, I think, in that moment too.
Which you talk to sort of any trauma specialist, of the largest issues with birth trauma is the loss of power, right? And disempowerment,
Exactly.
feeling
Yeah.
uninspired, right? And so I think you're right. It is revolutionary in the sense that we may be re-empowering people in the sense that these things aren't surprises, right? That you've already considered the decision before it's so emotionally laden and you've been in labor for 32 hours or whatever it is. And no, I think that's wonderful. And so
Yeah.
definitely throw the link on the screen.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and she talks about it being a communication tool through pregnancy. So you actually use it to have conversations at your appointments. Like, okay, so at this appointment, they always say to you at the end of well, not always, sometimes they're pretty rubbish, but you often get at the end of appointments, do you have any questions?
Mm-hmm.
And usually we go, no, because you haven't thought about it and you don't know. You probably do have 1,000 questions. You just can't think of them right then. And you've got a 5-minute chat with the care provider. So you just like, actually, you know what? Yeah, no, it's fine. I'll go. But for this, it's sort of like you have this format and you can then go, yeah, actually, today I wanted to talk to you about, about epidurals. Like what's the rules on epidurals at the hospital? Are you able to provide low dose epidurals where I can feel a bit more? Are you able to allow me out of the bed if I've got a low dose epidural and my legs are working? Or do I have to be on the bed? If I have to have a crash C-section and I am unconscious and my baby is well, can somebody express colostrum from me in order to give that to my baby over formula? Or if I am unconscious and I've had a crash cesarean and my baby is well, do not touch me to express colostrum, give my baby formula. They're two very different decisions to make. And it's like, it's a whole range of things. And some people might not even bother with that one because it's like, well, I'm not worried about that. Whatever happens, if that's the case, that's fine. I'm unconscious. I'm not concerned. Figure it out.
No,
but for some people, that will be really significant.
Yeah, I was yelling for a cup and they kept telling me, no, you're fine. Wait. And I kept saying, I will express this into your hand if you don't, and it was a thing. So yeah, no, it's wonderful. And I think that's such an important thing. And I love the part about the appointments too, right? Because you're giving someone this, it's a map. It really is.
Yeah.
It's a map. And it's like the choose your own adventure books without the bad endings.
Yeah. It's exactly like that. Yeah.
And I think that's such a wonderful thing. And it really does feel revolutionary, right? In the sense of giving that sense of empowerment, that sense of preparedness too, right? Because I think so much of it can be so intimidating, right? In the sense of just, I don't know what questions to ask, or I don't know who to say this to, or what I would do in case, right? And I think that's a wonderful tool. So I love that, the birth map.
It is. Yeah.
Great.
It's brilliant. So brilliant. She's a genius.
We may have found a title for the episode.
Yes. I hope Catherine won't mind. She won't mind. I'll ask her.
Nonetheless, so yeah, I think it's funny because we ended up sort of covering most of the questions that I had incidentally. And so would you sort of have any last advice for a mom that's kind of starting this path and doesn't really know if she'll have a doula or what she'll ask for, and just kind of some words of sage advice that you would leave people with?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're starting this for the first time, it's really scary a lot of the time, and it can be very easy to um underestimate what it is like to be in labor, to be vulnerable in labor, but also to be vulnerable in pregnancy, and to underestimate the level of support you need to get to take you through that journey. So sometimes it is just a question of it just financially you just cannot do it. And I hate that that's the case for a lot of women, but it is a reality sometimes. I would suggest that if you can in any way afford a doula, you should definitely consider it, because the stats are really good, really good on doulas. Like, the research is very clear that they have a huge impact on women's experiences of birth and labor and outcomes of birth and labor. I tend to think experiences are more important, and that's some of the research we're missing on that, because research doesn't care so much about experiences, it cares about outcomes. But yeah, I would suggest that you find some groups, find local groups that you can sort of be a part of, and you can hear stories, and that stories are the biggest tool that you will have. Like listening to people's birth stories, reading people's birth stories, it can really help you understand the kinds of things that people are up against, the kinds of things that happen, the kinds of decisions that different people have to make in pregnancy and in birth, and how you would feel about that. It can often like just go, oh yeah, you know what? I would have hated that. And so it's something that a lot of the time that can be the biggest educational resource, is just listening to people's stories. I think sometimes I see the advice that you shouldn't surround yourself with stories when you're pregnant because, all the fear and the whatever else. And I don't necessarily agree. I don't think that you should go out ambulance chasing terrible stories to prepare yourself for trauma at all. Like that's not what I mean. But I just mean general stories. In Australia, we have an amazing podcast called Australian Birth Stories, and there's a whole range of experiences on there, and it can just really help you understand the way the system works, or the way that birth works, and different experiences that people have. And because you'll hear the same kind of birth journey experienced in two very different ways. So it's just helpful to know that yeah, people have been through it and they will continue to go through it. Definitely, if you can afford the support from a doula, I'd suggest looking into one. But overall, find a care provider who aligns with you. That's kind of always my top tip is if you can't afford a doula, you can't afford any extra support, just really search hard for a care provider who has the same philosophy about birth as you. And, it can be hard to know what your birth philosophy is when you haven't been through it before, but consider it on like a medicalization spectrum of like, if you are a person who, gets a cold and immediately wants antibiotics to try and fix it, which won't work, by the way, because antibiotics don't work for a cold. If you're that kind of person and you know that you're going to want a lot of medical assistance in your birth, then you're down this end of the medicalization spectrum. If you're a person who really likes to try and do things naturally and holistically and heal things better, and you feel very confident in your body's ability to birth, then you might be all the way down here in the medicalization spectrum. And finding a care provider who sits on the same wavelength as you is critical, because they are the ones that you need to be able to trust to help you make decisions. And yeah, if they're not aligned, your decisions will be led differently. So
Wonderful advice. And actually, I've been reading about some of the legislation that's coming through in different states here, where they're actually trying to get doula care covered. So that will that actually comes through. And so you'll find that for some people on the low income spectrum of things, there might actually be some legislation that's coming down the pipeline to help get some of that covered and reimbursed.
That'd be amazing. Yeah.
Absolutely amazing. Yeah, it is. So I think there's some people who are really listening about it being transformative care and really,
Yeah.
and I think it comes, like you said, for someone who's advocated with you, who's been with you from the early stages, right? It's not rocket science to say that someone who knows you well may actually be able to help you, right?
Yeah, what a surprise. It's nice to have someone there,
You $8 million study to figure that one out.
Yeah, exactly.
And so if our listeners are trying to get in contact with you, how should they do that? Where do they find you? What's the...
You can find me in a lot of places. I am on Instagram at Katelyn.doula&nback. And I have a Facebook page. So my business is my name. So it's Katelyn Commerford, Doula and NBAC. And my website is www.katelynthedoula.com.au. And you can contact me any format. I sometimes tend to take a couple of days to get back to people, but I will always get back to you.
Okay. So, yeah. Well, thank you so much for being with us today. And it's been absolutely wonderfully illuminating information. And we're hoping that there's some moms and mamas to be out there that are listening and got some pearls of wisdom. So thank you.
Yeah, I hope so. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful week in love and light. As always, you can find us on our website at all the unexpected, one word, alltheunexpected.com, on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, even Pinterest these days at All the Unexpected. I always look forward to hearing feedback, and thank you all in love and light.